For over 25 years, members of the Springboro Area Historical Society have led tours of Springboro and shared stories of the important role Springboro played in the operation of the Underground Railroad. For thousands of school children, this tour brought to life what they learned in class. Springboro resident Don Ross leads this tour.
Hi, my name is Don Ross, and I'm with the Springboro Area Historical Society. One thing that we're proud of in Springboro and also in the society is the fact that we've been giving Underground Railroad tours for years. We started about 1996, and that's continued throughout the years. Today I'm going to give you that Underground Railroad tour. We'll begin a little bit of history here by talking about how Springboro got settled and what things led up to the fact that it became a major station on the Underground Railroad. Springboro was first settled after 1795, which was the Treaty of Greenville, the date of the Treaty of Greenville. And what had happened in that situation was that the threat that the Native Americans posed was pretty much stopped. It wasn't a fair situation historically, but what it did was open an entire area to settlement. And we had people moving in scattered parts of the township. It was heavily forested. There were no settlers around before that time. And then a man named Joel Wright, who had just previously surveyed and platted the new state capital of Columbus, Ohio, and that was in 1812, decided he liked this area so much that he was going to settle here. Well, he did settle. That was near Waynesville at that time, but what it did was pique the interest of his son, who at that time was residing in Pennsylvania. The Wrights were all Quakers, and so when Jonathan Wright moved this direction, moved west to find a place to settle, he invited many of his Quaker friends. And the group left and arrived in Waynesville in 1813, and he was going to settle there, and his dad said, "Jonathan, don't stop here. There's all that land west of here. Go find a place for yourself." And so Jonathan Wright went to the west and found an area where there was a creek, there were springs, plenty of water, and it was a scenic topography, and he decided this is it. This is where we're going to put our little Quaker city. His friends who had come with him told him, "Let's name this Wrightsville. Jonathan, you brought us here. Let's name it Wrightsville." And he said, "No, we're going to call it Springboro." And that's because of the abundance of water, of springs, the reason they actually settled here. So when they settled and Springboro was platted in 1815, the thing was that there were a bunch of settlers. They weren't waiting for a community to organize over the years. There were a bunch of Quakers here at that time. So he platted Springboro. Now, coincidentally with this, the Underground Railroad, which had started as a very secretive organization in the South, not really an organization because they weren't organized, but they had started in the South, and what they were going to do is help slaves gain their freedom. The determination was made if these slaves can some way find their way to Canada, in which slavery was illegal. It was in all the British properties in very early in the 1800s. If we can get them to Canada, they can be free. And the word spread all over the plantations. Now, what happened was that as the people in the South began helping these slaves, and there were a lot of Quakers down there that did that, North Carolina and Virginia and so forth, but there were other people helping too. And as that spread north, it began to get a little more organized, but there was still great secrecy about the Underground Railroad. And what happened, as we go through this story will unfold today, what happened was that Springboro became one of the chief centers on the Underground Railroad, one of the places that helped slaves, either by offering safe houses or by having conductors transport the slaves in the dark of night to the next safe place farther north. As we go on this tour, we'll look at some of the stories and some of the places that were involved in the Underground Railroad. But here I am standing in front of the Historical Society's museum. And this has got a nice little story to it, which has very little to do with the Underground Railroad, but it will be the basis and the foundation of what we talk about later today. This building behind me was the first building in the downtown section of Jonathan Wright Springboro. It was built in 1810. The Circa plaque behind me shows that. But the interesting thing is, this was settled by a man named Griffey Griffiths. Griffey liked this little piece of land here, so he just put a house up. The thing is, he didn't own the land. So Jonathan Wright came to him and he said, you know, I've had to pay a lot of money for this property, and we've got a nice little community planned, and people are paying me a fair price for their property. I'd like to ask you to pay for the land that you're on. Well, Griffey Griffiths was kind of a cantankerous old man, and he said, no, I'm not paying for this. I've been here almost 5 years. I'm not paying anybody for this. And he refused to pay. So Jonathan had a little problem on his hands. What happened was it kind of settled itself, because Griffey Griffiths had more or less an eye for the ladies. And his wife found out about that. Even in this small settlement, there were things going on. And so she drove him out of Springboro. He ended up in Indiana, but he was out of the house and out of the way. And Mrs. Griffiths said to Jonathan Wright, well, I'll pay for this. And he gave her a very fair amount, and she paid for it. And this became part of Springboro. But the building being here made some sense to Jonathan Wright. So he planned his main street right in front of where Griffey Griffiths had built the original house in this section of Springboro. And then over the years, this building became a butcher shop, a place for telephone operators, a small grocery shop. It had many uses over the years. However, one of them was not as part of the Underground Railroad. And now follow me, and we'll look at some of the stories and some of the buildings on the Springboro Underground Railroad. The building behind me was very important in the lore of the Underground Railroad here in town. This was a Thomas house. Jonah Thomas was the man of the family. His wife was here with him, and so was his son named Alf. And what happened was that these Thomas people had an arrangement with a man that lived near Hamilton. His name was Van Zant. And Van Zant would wait for a dark night without bounty hunters around, and he would bring a load of slaves, even if it was just one. It sometimes was more than that, all the way from the Hamilton area up here to the Thomas family. The Thomas family would then protect them during the next day and in some way move them on to a minister near Harveysburg, who would then be in charge of the group of slaves to get them to the next safe place. Well, one night, Van Zant was on his way here, and what happened was he got caught. He got caught with a wagon of slaves. There were 2 or 3 in the wagon, and he couldn't explain why they were there, and so the law arrested him. Now, the deal that they were going to make with him was, if you give us the name of where you were taking these slaves and where they came to you from, we'll let you off. At that point, you had to know that if you were going to help slaves on the Underground Railroad, even in a free state like Ohio, you were going to be punished, particularly after the Slave Act of 1860, where it was determined that anywhere in the country, no slave was anything but a slave, and they had to be returned to their owner. Anyone inhibiting that process would be jailed and also fined a lot of money. Van Zant refused to give a name, and he told the law, you do to me whatever you want to do with me, but I'm not going to give up the name of anybody else. And he didn't, which meant that the Thomases were free then to continue their lives in Springboro. Now here's a little bit of side information about where we are. After a while, the Thomases decided they didn't want to stay in this house anymore. And so they built one right straight across the street, and they moved into that. And the Springboro side of the story at this point becomes this. The bottom quarter on the left side of the building across the street in their new building, in their new house, became one of the first circulating libraries in this area. At that point, there were a few libraries that followed that policy, but most of them required that you take out a book and read it there and come back the next day and continue reading it. Well, the circulating libraries, as you know, you just worked like they did today. You just check out a book and read it and bring it back. And so Alf Thomas collected over 300 volumes from the Quakers and moved it into that section of the town and became a library. The thing you have to know about the Quakers through all of this is they were very cerebral, they were intelligent, they were very aware, and any community that had an abundance of Quakers was going to be a very progressive community. Okay, let's move on to the next stop. Here's a building that belonged to the sons of Jonathan Wright. In fact, he had it built for them. And in here, there was a general store, there was a post office. They used it, there were many uses over the years. It's on this Main Street now, it's one of the better looking, handsome houses on the streets, so full of those kind. The two sons of Jonathan Wright believed very much the way he did. And he actually had another son who also was very much in favor of everybody having their freedom. This has not been documented anywhere that we can find after years of research. But the best guess is that this was on the Underground Railroad as a safe house. It's a 3-story building, if you count the basement, so there are plenty of opportunities to hide slaves if they had to be hidden. And so our best guess is that this too was involved, although as I said, we can't find research anywhere that designates it. We're now standing in front of the Stanton House, and this house was very important to Springboro history. On an Underground Railroad basis, it was the home of Joseph Stanton, who was a relative of Edwin Stanton, who was President Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War. Joseph hid slaves in this house behind me. We think it was in the basement. A little more important to the story of the Underground Railroad was his brother. His brother was named James, and he lived about 2 miles on the east side of Springboro, current Springboro. He actually took wagon loads of slaves away from the south, brought them back up here to the north to his farm. And then he gave them the choice, working for him, and they could leave at any time they wanted. They would earn wages, or leaving immediately for the north. This also had 2 other distinctions. This house was the home of Lydia Wood for a long time after that. Lydia Wood was the aunt of the painter Grant Wood, who painted American Gothic, which was a picture of the old farmer standing there with a pitchfork and his very stern wife standing next to him. That wasn't his wife in the picture. That wasn't Lydia Wood in the picture. That was actually the sister of Grant Wood. But the way Lydia Wood enters the story is that Grant Wood would come and visit her often from his home in Iowa. The other thing is she raised a young boy in the house, a boy named Nathaniel, who grew up and left Springboro and became a close personal friend of the educator Booker T. Washington. We're now in front of the Jonathan Wright House. This was a founder's house. He built this in 1815. It was completed in 1815. And it was a very important stop on the Underground Railroad. You can imagine that, because it was the home of the leader of the Quaker group in Springboro. Let me tell you something else. We'll digress a minute and we'll come back to Jonathan Wright. Well after the end of the Civil War, and that actually didn't involve Jonathan Wright because he died in 1855, which was before the Civil War had ever started. But long after the end of the Civil War, the Ohio State educator, Wilbur Siebert, made it a project to completely research the Underground Railroad and to find out facts about the Underground Railroad, because it had been a very secret operation. Well, he came to Springboro. It was a logical place to start a Quaker community, and there were rumors that it was very active on the Underground Railroad. But he didn't get any help from Springboro people. They refused to acknowledge that they participated in the activity, and the reason for that was they thought they could still be punished, since what they had done was against the law. Well, he tried again a few years later using students from one of his classes, and he came to Springboro and tried a different tact, and it actually worked, and the story started spilling out. They turned into letters that he had copied for his books. He wrote 2 big tomes of literature about the Underground Railroad, and Springboro is a major part of one of those. So anyway, it was a secret among the Quakers, but everybody knew that Jonathan Wright was involved. And this house is wonderful because it has examples of the ways that the Quakers hid slaves. This was a safe house. In the upper floor, and that actually is the attic, there is a hidden room. You lift up a trap door, you look down at a triangular shaped room, and on each side there are slats. Those slats would have let slaves walk to the bottom of the room and also walk out when the activity was over from the bounty hunters. Then the trap door would be shut, the cartons or boxes or luggage or something would be put over the top of it, and the slaves were totally and completely safe. There were also 2 rooms in the basement. They weren't rooms really, they were tunnels. One of them, we're sure, ran out behind the house, and it went to a little outbuilding of Jonathan Wright's, where a man named Joseph took care of business on the property, and he led the slaves farther west to the deep, dark woods, which were never questioned or never searched by the bounty hunters. There was another tunnel which is collapsed. As a matter of fact, both tunnels were still viable as late as 1960. School kids from Springboro remembered playing in the house with the owner's kids, and the tunnels were still there. They've both collapsed now and been boarded up and painted over. But we figure the other tunnel was more or less just a hiding tunnel. So there were 3 places in this house that would hide slaves. And these Quakers, in their letters to Wilbur Siebert, noted how Jonathan Wright was very important to the Underground Railroad. It's a little bit hard to see from this shot, but the chimney on the top left is painted white. The side facing the south is painted white. That was a signal. If a slave was running, and that is if he wasn't being brought by somebody else, by a conductor, if he was on his own and running from the south, he looked up at the chimneys, and on any chimney that was painted white on the front side, that was a sign it was a good place to stop. The owner of this house now painted his chimney white so we could do tours and show people an example of the many signs that were used on the Underground Railroad. This is a Quaker cemetery. This was in Jonathan Wright's front yard, and by that I mean it's still a good distance away, almost 2 blocks away, but it was where he designed an area for Quakers to be buried. Now this has some Underground Railroad significance because right toward the middle is a huge gravestone with the name Jesse Wilson on it. Jesse Wilson was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and there are other conductors buried in here too. As you're looking around the cemetery from where we are, you see that there aren't a whole lot of stones. But you have to understand that Quakers, being very humble people, thought that that was a show-off item, a headstone. So many of them in here are buried, almost all of them are buried without headstones. That small collection of stones that you see in the middle of the cemetery, that was basically the Wright family. Every spot in this cemetery is filled. It has just evolved over the years that if there were more stones, they're not visible anymore. And there have been numerous counts of vandalism, which don't occur anymore because this cemetery is very much protected. If you could see from a ground level, a little bit hard to do, you would see that there are rills all the way through this cemetery. And if you understand what they are, the high points in the rills, the high points are where the caskets are lined up, and the low points are the areas in between. Now there's several things about this that you have to understand. First of all, the back of a cemetery was always held, a Quaker cemetery, for children. And it was a symbolic thing that there in the back of the cemetery, all these adults are protecting them. The other thing about this is that there's an unknown grave. Quakers were immaculate in the records they kept. And wherever there was a Quaker cemetery, there was a list, and that list included every body in every grave in the cemetery. But in this one, in this cemetery, if you go to what would have been row 7, number 7, it says unknown. This is what we think happened, and there's pretty much evidence that it probably did. Springboro only lost 1 slave during that whole section of time, and as I told you, they were never recaptured. None of them was ever recaptured. But one old gentleman hiding in a very small, tight little room in a house at 660 South Main passed away during the time that he was hiding. And so when the Quakers opened the door, he was gone. Well, now they had a problem because they were doing illegal activity. Here was the proof of it. It was a human being, so they weren't going to do anything disgraceful with the body. They sneaked him to the Quaker cemetery at night, and they buried him. And we think it was in row 7, number 7. Now this we're not totally sure about. This story has come down through the years, repeated over and over. And if you do look at the Quaker records, it does have 7-7 as unknown. So we like to think it's true. So this slave was trying to find freedom too, and in a way he did. And he's surrounded by those people who tried to take care of him on his way to freedom. Let's move on to the next place. This is a pretty important corner on Springboro's Underground Railroad. If you look to your right of this picture, there are 2 safe houses, actually a third that I'll explain in a minute, to the right. What we're looking at, if you look far enough down there, there may be a hint of a yellow building from this shot. That was 660, where the slave passed away. As you move closer, if you can see the intersection down there, there's a green building to the right of it. There's a brick building to the left of it. The building to the right of it was a station on the Underground Railroad. It had a tunnel, and the tunnel until just a few years ago you could get into. There was rubble in there. It was hard to go anywhere. but there was a tunnel in the basement. It may just have been a hiding tunnel. Couldn't get in far enough to see anything else. So they would have put a slave in there, put a cabinet or something in front of it, and the slave would have been pretty protected. Right across the street, as we get closer to us, where we are, you see the hint of a brick building. That's a one-story brick building, which has been a filling station in the past, also a bus garage, but originally it was a two-story brick building, which was the home of Malin Wright, who was one of Jonathan Wright's sons. And very strong evidence, in fact, irrefutable evidence, that that was a safe house on the Underground Railroad. So to the right, it's important that for those three houses, we're just on one corner now, and we're going to move to the left and look at what is now an iconic part of Springboro lore, and that's the K&W ice cream shop, which everybody in the whole Midwest has visited one time or another, which may or may not be true. Anyway, that building was originally a tannery. It was kind of like it is now, although it's been changed in many ways, particularly inside. But it was a tannery. And one of the byproducts of a tannery is that there's a strong stench coming from what they're doing, converting animal hides to leather and so forth. And it was so strong that the story goes that if a slave was hiding, they'd just open the door and let him in. He probably wasn't in for a very good day, but he was safe in there because the bounty hunters ignored it. And the bounty hunter dogs, if they had dogs, wouldn't have anything to do with it either. Now, just to the left of that is a big white house, which was owned by in-laws of Jonathan Wright. And it's very well known that that was also a safe house on the Underground Railroad. So all we've done here is covered maybe 4 blocks, a little more since we went sideways for a while, and yet look at all the evidences. If you walk out of the museum, when we were back there, I neglected to tell you that if you look north, on the other side of the street, there are 2 houses, a white one and a brick one, both of them were brick, that are right next to each other, that were owned by 2 members who were helping escape slaves, 2 residents of Springboro. So that's it. Now there's a lot to see in Springboro, as you've seen, as you've noticed today, but we also have a museum with more information and also a lot of items that are dedicated to the importance of Springboro as an Underground Railroad safe haven. Thank you. Here's a story to finish our Underground Railroad tour today, and it was documented by a newspaper. It really happened, and it's a story that explains a lot of things about the Underground Railroad. One day, a man from the east was leading a coffle of slaves across the Springboro area. It probably was in the area of 73 as it heads west. And he was noticed by a Springboro man. And the Springboro man, who was a Quaker, rode back into town and announced to anyone that would listen, hey, there's a guy with slaves, and he's walking across our property. He's walking across Springboro, and wherever he is, we don't care about that, but he shouldn't have those slaves in a coffle. So they rode out there. I'll tell you how many there were later. They rode out there and they accosted this man and tied him to a tree, and they tied him, his helpers, his staff, let's say, to trees, excuse me, and they rode off, freeing the slaves first. They told the slaves, run that way, pointing to the north. Run till nighttime and then look for a safe place. Follow the North Star, in case they didn't know about that, because they'd been slaves for a long time in all likelihood. So then they rode back. Well, the owner of the slaves got furious, as you can understand, and he freed himself. And he rode to Lebanon, the county seat, and he told the people in Lebanon, the lawmen, I was robbed by Springboro men. They stole $500 from me and they stole my slaves. Well, the $500 was probably made up by the slave owner. It was made up in order to get the lawmen into action. So they rode the law officers rode over to Springboro and they started questioning people. were you involved in this? Tell me where you were. Were you, do you know anything about this? And of course, everyone denied it until one man finally said, because he wanted to acknowledge that he was so against slavery, yeah, I was there. I was there. Were you by yourself? Who was there helping you? He wouldn't tell. But little by little, Springboro men came in and volunteered. They weren't going to let this guy be punished by himself. And they also affirmed their belief in getting rid of slavery. Well, I was there. You can arrest me. I was there. Well, the officers took back to Lebanon 17 Springboro men. And they were put in a dungeon, which was what they called the jail over there, because half the basement was underground. And they held them for one night, brought them to trial the next day. Now, the thing you have to realize is Lebanon was a county seat, but there were traces of Underground Railroad activity in Lebanon too. And many, many lawmen across the country, the North, were real upset with the fugitive slave law and the laws that preceded it, which indicated that you couldn't help a slave. In a free state or not, you couldn't help a runaway slave, or you could be punished. So they were brought to trial, and the judge in Lebanon fined them $5 per man and one more night in jail. That was nothing. You can imagine that the very next day, the Springboro men returned to their homes and continued to do the same thing. That is the Springboro Underground Railroad.